All right, Josh, live in Washington, D.C. I want you to stay with me for a little bit. I want to bring in our panel, Blake Hounshell, editor-in-chief of Politico magazine and the former managing editor of Foreign Policy magazine, and Abby Livingston, Washington bureau chief for the Texas Tribune. Blake, I want to start with you and pick up on that point Josh was talking about. It now appears that the president's decision on Syria, based largely on accepting the Turkish president's assessment of the situation on the ground, surprisingly, it comes in contrast to what we've been hearing from American military and foreign policy experts and even the president's own national security team. What are the implications of that when you have the American president, for the most part, basing his foreign policy decision on the leader of Turkey, not even other members of NATO? Because we've been hearing from the French and others, they actually oppose the decision to withdraw from Syria.
Yeah, well, it sounds like the president of Turkey was just stunned by Trump's decision to just pull out of Syria willy-nilly. And then he said, oh, hold on a minute. But then now it looks like Turkey's going to be able to go in there and do what it's always wanted to do. Turkey has this Kurdish population in its east and has a long, fraught relationship with that population, and those folks are allies with the Kurds in Syria. And so I think if you're Kurdish in eastern Syria, you feel betrayed. A lot of the special forces, the U.S. Special Forces, were working with those groups, and they feel betrayed by this decision. So it's a really precipitous move, and one that I think is going to build a lot of mistrust in the region.
I think we can all agree this is kind of leaving an open playground right now for the Iranians, the Russians,
and all their proxies.
The
Yeah,
exactly. Abby, I want to play part of what Acting Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney said about the Syria decision on Fox News. Take a listen.
We recognize the fact that this is unpopular within the Beltway. We recognize this fact it's unpopular within the Defense Department. It's very popular with ordinary American people. The people who ran when Donald Trump ran.
With all due respect to democracy, and I agree with you about that. Yeah. Do they really know what the stakes are of pulling U.S. troops out and leaving the Syrian Defense Force to the Turkish slaughter, and what the impact is going to be on Iran? I mean, really, we're going to make this a plebiscite?
Ordinary Americans have no idea about those things. They elect the president so that he does.
The question, does the president know about these things? Either. I mean, and so we can naturally assume, and I think most of us have made this assumption, Abby, that the president is making a lot of decisions based on his base and what they think, which makes sense when you talk about the economy, right? Because it's affecting their pocketbooks directly. But when you're talking about Syria and you know the majority of his base don't really know what is best for what we're doing in Syria, you got to question that.
Well, I think one thing that's going on is this past week, I think more than the actual midterms in November, is going to mark a changing point in this Trump administration. And tied with the shutdown, tied with the other chaos, this is rattling Wall Street. And how does that's still an abstract concept to the average American, but 401k retirement statements are starting to come out. And a lot of Americans who maybe aren't paying attention specifically to Secretary Mattis or even know who he is, there's an indirect implication that their retirement statements could get hit because Wall Street is becoming rattled. And that's when things really start getting consequential, I think, in politics.
Yeah, and speaking of Wall Street, we'll talk a little bit about that later on in the program. But Josh, I wanted to get your thoughts on another part of the anti-ISIS coalition. Brett McGurk, the highest civilian official, who's kind of the, I would say the person who brought the coalition together under Obama, maintained it during the Trump years. He's also resigned in protest. The president tweeted that he didn't even know him and called him a grandstander. So, it seems kind of odd that the president wouldn't know the top point man in the administration who's overseeing this anti-ISIS coalition. I know that Susan Rice, the former national security advisor, tweeted out alarmingly about that. Give us a sense of the fact that he is now peeled away, that he's resigning, one more layer of the anti-ISIS fight breaking apart.
Difficult for the president to simultaneously say, Brett who? I don't know this guy. And I'm the guy who has defeated ISIS and has brought, the elimination of this extremist group. But for Brett McGurk, there was very little option, really, about what he could be able to do at this point, because he, for the last several years, has been the guy whose job it was to go around the world to the 60-some-odd countries that have been fighting and supporting the U.S. in its fight against ISIS in Iraq and Syria, saying, look, put your men and women on the battlefield with us, fight alongside us. This is a critical global security threat. We need all of our allies to really come out and support us and be with us on this. And you can be assured that the U.S. is committed long-term to Syria's stability, to its future, and to eliminating the threat of extremist attacks coming out of Syria and Iraq. And then the next day have to be able to say, actually, just kidding, we're going home, we're doing it right away, we're doing it without consulting any of our allies who have been fighting with us, and that's just the president's decision. So for Brett, it was essentially contradicting everything he's been working for the last many years, and he felt like it was an untenable situation.
Well, you lead to my next question. Blake, this is to you. You actually wrote in Politico magazine, the decision to withdraw from Syria by itself is not controversial. In fact, the president tweeted that if anyone else had made the decision, they would have been praised. We talk about Mick Mulvaney basically saying that the base chooses a president that makes the decision. They trust them, but yet they also choose someone who surrounds himself in a cabinet with people they trust. He's not necessarily listening to his cabinet here, as we've been reporting. So it's really about the way in which the president has gone about making this decision, more so than anything else.
Yeah, I could easily imagine a President Hillary Clinton saying, you know what? It's not working out in Syria. Why are we there? I doubt she would have gotten there this quickly, but certainly a lot of Americans are scarred by U.S. wars in the Middle East. And so I'm sure the president's decision is popular in some quarters, but you don't just do this thing on a whim and a tweet without consulting allies, without working through the options in the Pentagon and through the interagency process. This is something that the president seems to have done in a fit of pique and because he could. And now we're seeing the consequences play out. A lot of doubt among U.S. allies about America's commitment to the world and to 70 years of foreign policy that Mattis wrote about in his resignation letter.
And did the president do this in order to change the news narrative as well, away from the Mueller probe and to Syria? Yeah, that's always a question that has to be on the back of everyone's mind as well. I find it interesting that when the decision was taken to go into Syria, there was a lot of controversial points being made that the president did so without any authorization from Congress. But it underscores when you go to war without the authorization of Congress, the withdrawal of American troops without the authorization of Congress can also be problematic. Abby, let me get your final thoughts on where we go from here with the new acting Secretary of Defense, Patrick Shanahan. He's going to be taking over. What more do we know about him? He doesn't have any military or foreign policy experience, but what kind of governing style, what kind of ideology, perhaps, does he subscribe to that we can expect? Well, and how long do we expect him to stay?
Well, I am not terribly familiar with him, but from a larger point of view, that may not necessarily be relevant because in past presidents, George Bush, Barack Obama, when you think of them in foreign policy with their administration. You think of their cabinet, their secretaries of state, defense. As these people peel off from the Trump administration, the first team that he appointed, there are less substantial figures replacing the ones that were in there initially. And it becomes less and less about the Trump administration and an unfiltered Trump himself making these choices. And the onus is going to fall on him when history looks back on what happens over the next 2 years.
All right, Josh Lederman, Blake Hounshell, Abby Livingston, thank you all.